Morning everyone, it's Elliott here. Hope you're doing well. I'm just out and about in Essex, in England, near where I'm from, just down by the River Thames, near to where I live. And for you American lot, yes, it's not far away from where people from the only way is Essex are. And yeah, sort of that way is just down at the bottom of Essex by Kent. And then you go that way, or this way, down the river. You go more towards London that way. So yeah, I just thought I'd make a quick video today just to show that I'm a quote-unquote normal person, just from Essex, who suffered terribly from chronic OCD, and how, you know, it just doesn't discriminate. And yeah, I went through you know, the ringer with OCD. I went through probably the hardest time of my life with OCD, chronic OCD, for a period of about 10 years, from the ages of about sort of 15, 16 to the age of about 26, 27. And yeah, I just wanted to show that it doesn't discriminate, OCD. You know, you could be famous, a 10 out of 10 model and have everything going for them, or you could be somebody who doesn't have very much. And yeah, you can still get caught with OCD. You know, it does not discriminate. You know, me and the team are just people who have had this disorder and who are now really sharing our knowledge of that. And you know, I remember when I had chronic OCD, you know, it was anxiety and that uncertainty from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep. You know, I found my environment to be a very dangerous place. You know, constantly triggered, constant anxiety, panic attacks, nausea. You know, with the sexual orientation fears, I was constantly surrounded by like my worst case scenario, and I didn't have much of a life. You know, I avoided everything, constant compulsions. My life was a compulsion. It was literally wake up, barely even leave my house, spend all day in my room, just doing compulsions, double checking, avoiding the world. I couldn't look at people in the eye. You know, I'd be walking around just staring at the ground because I found looking at those exposures in the environment for HOCD2 triggering. And I was just completely a shadow of the person that I was now. You know, no confidence, you know, no sort of vitality. I was just so concerned about where the next trigger was coming from. It was almost like I felt I was on a plane that was about to crash in every moment of my life. You know, those big spikes of anxiety that felt very uncomfortable. And I thought, you know, how do I possibly carry on like this? Let's get some background in, actually. It's a bit of a gloomy day, as you can see. But yeah, there was all of that going on, and I literally thought, how am I possibly going to get out of this? You know, my brain's too far gone. I'm the exception. My fears are going to come true. All of this is absolutely real. It's not OCD. And OCD will give that impression, the realness factor it will give. You know, you can't see the wood from the trees, right? It feels like your deepest, darkest fears are coming true, and that terror and that realness factor that the brain gives makes it feel like you can't possibly see past that, right? So that's why acceptance, of course, is so important, because it gets under it at the core. It gets under it either way, even if that was real. And of course, it's very much a process of getting towards acceptance. You know, there's so many different angles to it for each fear, you know, for each theme. You know, in my case, maybe a sexual orientation fear, there's, you know, the fear of rejection, fear of self-rejection, the fear of disgust, the fear of the uncertainty, the fear of things never going back to how they were, the fear angle. You know, there's so many different angles with each fear that comes with it. You have to really think about cutting off that supply line by breaking down each segue into that fear, like I just explained there, right? So there's a lot of moving parts to OCD. You know, avoidance behaviors as well, like I touched on before. You know, compulsions. How are you showing to the brain that you're still scared of this particular thing? And of course, you know, compulsions really do that. You need to try and abstain from those, of course. And I know it's so tough, because every ounce of your being is wanting to double check that feared scenario. You feel that really strong pull to double check, and it's almost like, well, how do I not check in that moment when my brain is screaming at me? And you know, the withdrawal symptoms from that are very, very difficult. You know, when I gave up compulsions, I found it so tough. My body was screaming at me in many ways. But you have to treat it like a drug addict or an alcoholic who's having a beer. You know, you really have to try and take away those things that satisfy that craving and satisfy that demand that the compulsion gives. And it's, you know, you're really trading short-term discomfort for long-term gain, because otherwise you're going to be stuck with OCD for the rest of your life. And you know, it'd be a travesty to do that when there are the tools in the 21st century now to recover, right? So yeah, there's all of that going on. And I just remember like some of the really lowest moments in my journey as well. I remember I was on a flight home from Thailand, right? And I used to find it so difficult to sit in the aisle seats because I was constantly faced with that exposure in the environment. And I remember just having this crippling anxiety. You know, my stomach was absolutely churning. I remember spending, you know, a lot of that flight in the bathroom just vomiting because of how strong the triggers were. You know, it had a very bad impact on my health, did OCD. You know, I had constant sort of heart palpitations, tachycardia. My gut health was completely ruined. You know, I'm still sort of picking up the pieces from that now, but I had, you know, really bad acid reflux, cramps, you know, leaky gut, you know, constantly being sick, and you know, an immune response has been produced by the body because you know, how much anxiety was breaking down my body in many ways. You know, my gut lining was completely eroded. So I had all of those things, you know, panic attacks, just moments of being really, really low, depressed. I went into depression as well, just a bit of magic thinking that came in there. So I really was up against it. You know, I really had to go through some really, really dark times, and I thought that I'd never be in the position that I am today, right? It took a lot of work, of course, but I knew that I just, you know, what other choice did I have? I had to put the work in. As soon as I knew OCD recovery was there, really resonated with me, and it was bang, 10 pack straight away. Let's really get to the core fears. So yeah, it's so tough, OCD. You got to have a lot of compassion for yourself. Take it day by day. Sometimes it's even minute by minute. You know, I remember sometimes when I'd be in a bar with my friends doing the recovery journey, and I'd get the strongest trigger, right? And I remember, you know, it's sort of 10 out of 10 on the Richter scale, so to speak. And I'd almost be like holding my hands at the bar, like trying not to go into tears because of how uncomfortable it was. And, you know, I remember those times and I just think, how did I get through it? But I did. You know, we're more resilient than we let on to be, and we can definitely stand a lot more than we realise, right? So yeah, there was all of that going on. And yeah, I just remember as well some of the things that I used to do with OCD looking back. And one of the things I used to do was, in my room I had pictures of my favourite footballers, and when I was stuck with HOCD, what I'd do was I'd turn those pictures around the other way because I couldn't face looking at them. Can you imagine that? And then as well, so I would, in my house where there were like pictures of my friends and family as well, I'd also do the same thing. I'd take them down or turn them around or take them off of their perch just so I didn't have to look at them as I went about my day in my house. You know, can you imagine that? That's how bad, you know, my OCD was. I was so scared of that particular feared scenario, I just couldn't face looking at it. And then also as well, I went too far the other way. So what I would sometimes do is, in the environment, I'd try and overexpose myself and try and look at everybody, but that was super compulsive, right? And it almost looked a bit strange trying to look at everybody, right? And that was when the exposures were getting a bit compulsive. That was a fear angle coming in. But, you know, just the sheer confusion that I had in those moments, like I was so confused about what to do. I didn't really know what to do. I remember sending Nick like numerous voice notes, you know, me feeling hopeless. You know, what do I do in this moment? How do I know that I'm not doing recovery wrong? All of that was just the fear angle creeping in. And, you know, that element really does sort of come to the surface as you move on in the recovery journey, as you confront the core fears. As the core fears tend to come down, fear is what tends to be left. So that was where fear needed a lot more work, right? So yeah, there was all of that going on, and I was so scared of not recovering, and, you know, scared of not going back to who I was. And, you know, to an extent, you know, you're not going to be the same person once you do go through the recovery journey, because, you know, the recovery journey is going to change you so much, you know, in a good way, of course, you know, with the more rational perspectives, more rational beliefs. And of course, we're not the same person that we even were, you know, last week, because we're a process, we're constantly changing, right? So you can't really put your finger on the person that you are now and the person that you was, you know, maybe even 2 weeks ago, because of how much we're changing. There's so many moving parts. So, you know, of course it's valid, and I understand why you want to get back to who you were, but, you know, the same man never really steps in the same part of the river twice, because he's a different man and the river's different. That's a great quote by Heraclitus. But yeah, you know, recovery is getting back to that stage where you're back to that position where but like almost like before OCD recovery set in, right? You know, there's that baseline level of calm, there's no chronic anxiety, you're not worried about where the next trigger is coming from, there's a lot more energy, and you know, there really is sort of that vigor for life, and you want to go out and enjoy yourself and do the things that you would have done if you wasn't with OCD or stuck with OCD. And you know, that life is really waiting for you out there. It really is, you know. And of course, you know, recovery doesn't also mean certainty about these things. You know, I'm not saying it is, but you know, the goal is acceptance and to become more rational about those worst case scenarios. And as you do that, you know, things start to lift, and you know, you start to feel a lot better, right? So acceptance is the goal. How you feel after that is a byproduct of that. You know, I remember I tried to use acceptance as a tool to get certainty, and of course that was when OCD held all the cards, right? You know, you're never really going to get certainty. It's like if I had contamination OCD, you know, and I recovered, I'm not going to get certainty that I'm not going to get sick, or that I'm not going to infect somebody else, because you know, scientifically that can happen. You know, scientifically there are so many possibilities that we're still prone to, even though we have a doubting disorder. It doesn't necessarily block us from that. But having said that, you know, with those rational perspectives that we have, the response of the brain to those things, if that did happen, is nowhere near as what it was if we were going through the recovery journey. And that's when we get to live more efficiently, and that's when we get to manage all of that, right? So yeah, acceptance is the goal, you know, chipping away day by day, bit by bit. It's not a process that just happens overnight, but as you do that, you gradually disarm OCD. And yeah, there really is so much hope. You know, I thought I had no hope, as did the other coaches, you know, Nick, Gemma, Mommy and Sam, Rob, who I'm incredibly grateful for, you know. And yeah, there's a life out there waiting for you. You know, freedom awaits, and it might not seem like that now, but you just got to take it day by day, do what you can. Consistency and discipline with the recovery work is so key. You know, there are times when I'd get home from work and I just think, you know, I can't be bothered to do the recovery work, but you know, I forced myself to do it. I made myself do it, and you don't really see the fruits of that labor in the moment. You see it compounded over a long period of time. So it's almost like going to the gym. You don't really see it in that moment, but as you really work at it over a long period of time, that is when you start to see the change and progress. And it's so important that you stay consistent, because otherwise you're just going to open yourself up to a setback, right? So yeah, of course there's lots of moving parts to OCD. It does feel quite confusing, you know, where do I start, where do I begin? But yeah, just think about your main compulsions, your main avoidance behaviors. What's the low-hanging fruit? What's that one area where you're really like you could really target to make good growth and progress? You know, for me, I wasn't really much of a reassurance seeker. I was more so bit of a compulsive exposure doer, and I was quite I was very compulsive as well with double checking things. So the compulsions were my main bugbear. Other people, yeah, it might be reassurance, it might be confession, it might be avoidance. So think about what that main thing is if you're really puzzled about where to go, and then start thinking about how you can tackle that. And then as you tackle that, the road becomes a lot clearer for what you need to tackle next. Then maybe it's the subtle internal compulsions that you have. You know, I had a lot of those. They were also the last to go, along with fear of fear. I tackled the main compulsions, but I had a lot of sort of internal checking compulsions, you know, checking for attraction, sort of refocusing thoughts, rechecking thoughts, all that sort of stuff going on. So I had to really work at those once I had the main sort of crux of the recovery process sorted. All right, so yeah, you know, we can really help with that. Again, like I said, I'm just a normal person, you know, from Essex, who's been through chronic OCD, and you know, now my job here with the rest of the team is to help you with your OCD recovery journey, because you know, we have that first-hand experience and we really know what it takes to recover. So yeah, really fortunate and lucky to be in this position now, helping other people. It would be nice if the weather was a bit better for this video today, wouldn't it? But hey ho, that is one of those things. So yeah, that's about it for me, guys. You know, like I said, please reach out to us if you are struggling. You know, we've got that first-hand experience, and yeah, there is hope. Take it day by day. You can recover. I know it feels like you won't be able to do that, but you know, as you chip away day by day, you know, things do gradually and you know, gradually start to become clearer. All right, so yeah, thanks for this, guys, and I'll see you on the next video. Cheers, bye.